Hello, everybody. So I'm Martyn from Zuplo, the most programmable API gateway. But we also have a bunch of open source technologies like Rate My Open API and Sudoku that you already heard about from Martyn. Thank you very much for doing my job for me. Cheers. And today I'm going to talk about how AI is coming for your APIs. And the form that they have chosen for this is that of agents. There's a whole bunch of AI agents that are being built every day. Some are being created by developers who absolutely understand what they're doing. But many, many more are being created by agentic platforms. They're being created via vibe coding. They're being created by people who don't necessarily know what they're doing. And because of that, maybe not respecting good API practices when they're doing it. You need to ensure that your platform, your API, is up for the challenge of the agents that are coming for it. So we're going to talk about some of the things that are going to help to ensure that you don't get destroyed by the onslaught of AI agents. So quickly, we'll talk about what AI agents actually are, for those that don't know. They exist in multiple forms. They can be very tiny little singular bots that just do one job, and when they're done with it, that's it, it's all over. Some are part of like more dense multi-agent groups where they're doing a job and then handing off the result of that job to another agent that does something else, hands it off to another agent that does something else, and hands it off to another agent that does something else. And it doesn't really matter kind of what form they exist in, they're ultimately all following the same kind of pattern. And that is effectively something like a validation loop, right? So they have an input. From that input, they make a decision about some kind of tool that they're going to use. From that point, they make a decision about how the LLM is actually going to respond to that. It's going to decide, based off of the schema that it's got from that particular tool, does it have enough information to continue from that point? Then it's going to actually go and make the request to the tool. It's going to call an API to actually make the thing happen that has been requested. And that response is going to come back, and it's going to continue around until it ultimately achieves its task. It creates a continuous cycle that just goes around and round until it's actually done what it is that it needs to do. Now, the bonus of this is that APIs in this context are still the future. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to change anything. Yes, other tools that are not using APIs, like computer use or OpenAI's operator, that are working more with front-end interaction, they are out there, but they do kind of get easily confused and they're not as efficient. And this is something that we've already solved for this inefficiency, and that was that we created programmatic access to data via APIs. So even if your APIs aren't public, you do already have APIs if you have a website, most likely. You just call them internal APIs. And agents, they can still find those. They can still try to use them. And even if they're not supposed to, they're still going to have a good go at trying to get data out of that. So we need to prepare for this agentic future. And how do you do that? Well, you need to mitigate risk. With any API, that's true. But it usually means ensuring that your API security and your usage policies are on point. Now, one of the things that people really try to do here is just detect agents, right? We've got AI agents coming for the API. Well, we can just block them, right? We can decide, let's just say anything that's coming in that we don't recognize, we're not going to allow it, which is kind of a fool's errand, I think, at this point. It's not particularly useful for you to just block that traffic completely. I don't think that the strategies that are currently in place are going to be particularly durable. It's kind of similar to the web scraper wars that we saw previously, right? It's a war of attrition. You're almost encouraging people to just lie about the kind of traffic that they're sending to you. It's better, I think, to just consider that you can accept and monitor traffic, understand what the agents are trying to do, have them actually tell the truth, monitor the user agent that comes through from that particular agent, and decide what it is that it's trying to achieve, and hopefully you can design better systems to approach that. One of the ways that this is actually being made a little bit easier now is via something called HTTP message signatures, which is where you can actually do better verification, cryptographic verification, that an AI agent is actually what it says it is. And you can confirm that the traffic that you're getting is actually real and definitely from that agent. So one of the things that's also important here is to think about how you actually catalog your API. We've heard in some of the talks already this evening about OpenAI. And in this instance, actually understanding where your APIs exist and which ones are actually available for agents to consume is a really important thing to do. One of the best ways you can do this is in some kind of form that is readable by those agents, something that's going to work programmatically, because they're not really able to differentiate between an internal or an external API. They're simply going to, especially if they're scraping your website, they're just going to try and do the job that they've been tasked to do, and they're very persistent about that. So you, as developers, need to get an accurate picture of all of the APIs that you have. If you don't do this already, it's probably a good time to start. You can use API detection tools like Demystify, which will go and look at everything that's available as far as APIs are concerned to show you what it is that you actually have as far as all the APIs that are available, everything that could potentially be used, scraping or otherwise, internal or external, it doesn't matter. Give you an idea of how to build a catalog that you can then force agents towards to actually make sure that they're making the right decisions about the APIs that you want to use. One of the other things that's valuable here is API gateways. You want to make sure that once you actually have an inventory of those APIs, you've got some kind of consistency. Consistent authentication for the endpoints that you have, consistent policy management for those endpoints, consistent governance about how new endpoints are actually deployed to that gateway. OpenAPI native gateways like Zuplo can be used to do this, but you can build this into your code base if you really want to, but a gateway is going to help you to kind of separate those concerns a little bit more so you can abstract that specificity away from the core product. Authentication, unauthenticated APIs are pretty leverageable by agents, especially if they're going down the route of scraping. They don't need to go through any login flow to get a token. So you do want to make sure that this is something that really can't happen unless you absolutely want it to. Even when you have authentication, you really have to ensure that based on that authentication, user A can't access records of user B, right? If you were just making straight up API calls as a developer, you would probably protect against that. But an agent could potentially do this by mistake or intentionally, just when trying different combinations of code that it wants to execute against that particular API. The model context protocol, which I'll cover a little bit more in a bit, is helping to ensure that tools are properly authenticated when it comes to this. And that effort is moving very, very quickly. But it's still really not defined enough at the moment to ensure that that's definitely going to happen all of the time. You also want to consider object-level authorization. According to the OWASP non-human identities top 10, it's a great read, look it up. There's authorization issues that you want to watch out for, and these are good ones to consider. Secret leakage is something that can definitely happen. You don't want to have agents pasting API keys into a vibe coder's public GitHub repository. That's going to be problematic. You also don't want overprivileged access to be something that you fall for here as well, especially if you consider something like operator, right? You don't want an agent that's using operator to be able to go in via the UI, change the settings for itself, and give itself a higher level of privilege based off of what it's been done. Schema validation is also very valuable in this case as well. 75% of production APIs still today suffer from API drift. So there are APIs out there that just don't match the spec that they're originally designed for. You also want to be able to detect suspicious patterns of behavior. So you don't want to be able to be subjected to SQL injection or any kind of malicious things. You still want to ensure that request parameters, headers, and body content that might indicate that someone is trying to manipulate your database queries isn't actually happening. And again, a gateway or a web application firewall can certainly help with mitigating this. Rate limiting is one of the most important things in any API, whether it's being used by agents or not. Automated systems and agents can fail hard at scale sometimes. They can potentially get stuck in loops and fire off thousands of requests, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by mistake. But one of the other things to consider is potentially creating bulk operation APIs here, so that if you do have a whole bunch of requests that do need to be made, you've got an API that can actually handle that traffic or is specifically built for that particular traffic. Quotas are also very important here too. An agent being able to understand and track how much traffic it's allowed to send you is going to be useful for its own decision-making purposes. If it knows that it can't actually make any more than 10,000 requests in a particular day, and it knows that up front, and it's able to check that, then it's going to be able to self-regulate much more than trying to throw all the traffic at it and then get rate limited and have to figure out what to do after that, because maybe that's the point where it just starts to fail at the job that it's trying to do. Error handling is, in many ways, the dialogue that you have between an agent and your API, especially if they're more autonomous, right? They're just making requests. If they get errors, they have to understand what that error means. They have to understand what to be able to do next. So making your error description very usable from an agentic point of view is going to help with that reasoning. So you can use formats like problem details, which is going to give you more of an insight into actually what problem occurred and how you can solve it. But you can also include more information about what can be done to fix the error that ultimately occurred. So you can put recommended next steps or actions into that response to see if it's something that can then be taken from that point. Point at documentation potentially that's going to help that agent to understand what it needs to do to solve that particular problem. One thing to remember, in that particular case though, don't overshare too much, because the more you give away, the more possibility that somebody could then also use that same response to reverse engineer your API, which would be problematic. So we're at this point where we have customer experience, the developer experience, and now we're thinking about an agentic experience as well. So this is the point where you have to learn to love the agents, and there is a lot to learn. But AI usage can be a game changer for the adoption of your platform, more than many people probably know at this point, because all of this is really very new. But agent experience is kind of wide open. One of the examples that I think is particularly good is that, are you familiar with Neon, the Postgres service that continues to pop up pretty much all over the place? Well, they have a whole team now that is dedicated to making sure that the API, the documentation, and all the things that surround that are so well built that it effectively makes them the agentic choice for Postgres. There's also an email provider called Resend that has seen significantly more signups now coming from agentic recommendations than coming from SEO or other methods. And this is a direct result of AI just deciding that Resend is the platform that developers should be using to send emails. So having public APIs goes a long way in terms of encouraging that particular API usage. We're at a point now where basic developer documentation is great, but sometimes there are situations where you need to make more than one API call in order to achieve a particular task. Maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Ultimately, if it's something like, I want to sign up and I want to get an API key, then there's at least 2 things that need to happen in there. So the documentation that we give to agents to understand this needs to change a little bit more than just the standard API reference. switching it towards use case-driven documentation is very much the same way as you would write a guide for a developer to follow to understand how to get to that same use case. The bonus here is that you don't need to make it as wordy as it would be if you were writing that guide. In fact, it would be beneficial if you didn't. LLMs, they understand a lot of text and they have a lot of context. They can deal with a lot of words, but they're kind of subjective about some of those words. So the more on point you can be about, this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3, this is the URL, this is the request, this is what it needs to look like, this is the schema, and this is how you authenticate it. The more basic it can be, but still on point with the use case, the better it's ultimately going to be. How you document that is kind of up to you. Markdown works great, but ultimately the content itself matters more than the format that you give it. Self-service, this is going to be a tricky one, and it's certainly going to be an interesting space to watch, but agents aren't going to book a demo. They're not going to come and ask to see how your API works before using it. So your platform does need to be as self-service as possible, maybe even more so than it is today. That includes the authentication, how they get access to the API, how they generate keys, and ultimately how they pay for it, which is going to be a really interesting thing. When there's complete autonomy inside of the AI space here, do you give your agent a credit card? How do you do that? I don't know the answer to that one, but I'm fascinated to see who comes up with the services that are going to back that. And then finally, of course, Model Context Protocol is helping to make extremely large steps towards giving agentic control a little bit more of a barrier than just go for it with the API and see how it works out. Exposing your APIs through MCP is probably the best idea right now because it gives you the control over what those tools actually look like, how they work, and based off the ever-evolving Model Context Protocol specifications, it just changed again last week. There is more of a process now and more standardization around how you work with tools and also, more importantly, how you authenticate those tools. But with MCP, you can orchestrate functionality much better. It isn't just a simple one tool to one endpoint relationship anymore. The tools that you create are there to serve the use cases that agents are ultimately going to expect. And you'll be helping them by going down this route. As long as you don't overload your MCP server with 100 tools. I saw recently that there is an MCP server for, I think it's the HubSpot API. And if you've ever seen the HubSpot API, it's pretty big. It's been around for a while and there's a lot going on with it and it has multiple versions. But a lot of the things that it does are kind of similar. So you end up in a situation where if you associate one MCP tool to one endpoint, you've got a whole bunch of endpoints that could potentially do the same thing. And that is something that can confuse an LLM. You want to give it the right level of difference so that it can very easily decide based on, good specificity and uniqueness, yes, this is the thing that I need to make that tool work, rather than here's 3 and I'm going to decide which one is the best one to use, because that's where you end up with all of the different kinds of problems that can come from that and also a lot of potential failure as well. So the biggest thing and the takeaway that I would definitely leave you with here is that this is all very new. It's all very fresh. Things like Model Context Protocol have only been around since November of last year and already have changed significantly in that time. And I expect that they're going to change even more significantly for the rest of this year. So try to consider putting in place more of the basics of good API best practices across the board of all of the APIs that you have, whether you know about them or not, because that's going to help you when it comes to not over-engineering to keep up with the new and the shiny, but know that when you do need to implement this stuff, the API basis that you have inside of your organization is working to the best of its ability and protecting you against the stuff that you need to be protected against. One quick plug before I go. If you want to do a remote MCP server for your API and you want to do it free and super quickly, you can do it with Zuplo. And if you go to that link, you can sign up and find out how. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the presentation, Martin. That was awesome. I wanted to add to the MCP server for HubSpot. I got a similar experience with Atlassian. You connect it and you get like 120 tools or so. So not, but they are getting there. Anyway, I had a question specifically about use cases. So OpenAPI initiative recently standardized Arazo specification. Do you think, like, do you see future in that? Like, maybe is it something like worth investing in, like, to sort of describe use cases in this format?
I think it's always good to have, a spec that can be generated programmatically, right? Which is certainly that. You can generate an OpenAPI document with an LLM. Again, as you saw with Martyn's talk, you can do it really well, and the score that you're going to get from that in the terms of the coverage is great. The same works for the Arazo specification as well. If you want to define a document that's very solidified in terms of defining a use case, and here are the steps involved in it, and you also want to maybe generate that with AI, you can, and it will work great. The downside with Arazo specification is that it's still very new, and the level of tooling that's available for that is definitely nowhere near what is available for OpenAPI. I kind of hope that there is going to be a little bit more of a move towards using it, especially for programmatic description of use cases, and it will certainly work, I think, very well for defining how tools should be generated for use with things like MCP. But right now, it's just a spec, and it feels like there's still there's a very big gap to jump still between being able to generate that and actually have it be useful enough to build into your own workflows to the point where people would adopt it en masse.
I would like to ask, how does one become up to date with all the latest trends that are happening there, all the tooling, all the new frameworks that are there? What is the best way you would suggest us to follow in order to stay up to the latest trends?
You have to spend an inordinate amount of time online and pray. I would suggest that it's crazy because the amount of stuff that's coming out all the time is really generally overwhelming. But there's one newsletter that I can recommend people check out. It's called Smol, SMOL.ai, and it's created by a guy called Sean Wang. And effectively what he's done is he's created a whole bunch of bots and agents to go out and understand everything that's happening across social and also many news and media outlets to see what's going on. And then he has this basically succinctly collected all together and send out a daily update of everything that's going on in the world of AI. And some days it's a load of stuff, but it's very nicely put together, and it gives you all of the highlights that you would really need to know about everything pretty much. And some days it just says nothing much happened today. Those are great days, free days.